The eldest brother looked at the chained magistrate, not with hatred but with a cold, judicial clarity. His voice was quiet. It cut through the groaning of the walls and the hum of the hidden weapons. He said, "We trusted you to be strong, and you were stronger than any of us deserved." The words were not praise. They were an epitaph, a final judgment on an empire that had mistaken cruelty for power. The mother's pain, her raw wrists and silent endurance was no longer a personal wound. It became a rallying cry, a flag around which an entire species could finally unify. Her suffering was the moral justification written in blood and electro-welts for what came next. The Empire's brutal display was meant to be its ultimate show of strength. It became its fundamental failure. They had a script, a predictable level of cruelty designed to elicit a predictable response: submission. But they went further. They exceeded the expected. They made a public spectacle of a mother's breaking. This was not strength. It was a lack of control, an arrogance so profound it blinded them to the line they had crossed. That excess changed everything. It shifted the moral high ground. An act of calculated vengeance was no longer just revenge. It was justice. The Empire's own actions had legitimized a response of a scale and fury they could not comprehend. They had written their own condemnation. The public torture, the cheering nobles, the cold indifference, it was all evidence. A galaxy-wide broadcast of their moral bankruptcy. Humanity did not need to argue its case. It merely presented the footage. The Empire's signature was on the document. Humanity just provided the final punctuation, a period in the form of a fleet, a question mark in the form of a hijacked broadcast, an exclamation point in the form of 3 children standing in their hall of power. Justice was no longer an abstract concept. It became an inevitable outcome, delivered not by a higher power, but by a species that had been pushed past the point of negotiation. The coordination of this assault was the product of that moral certainty. It provided the unifying purpose. The eldest sibling's strategic mind laid the groundwork, a multi-phase operation that treated space and cyberspace as a single, interconnected battlefield. The middle sibling's technological genius was the key, exploiting the Empire's own networked infrastructure, turning their communications into a weapon and their defenses into a liability. The youngest sibling's disruptive energy was the spark, the unpredictable element that kept the enemy off balance and reactive. They moved in perfect sync because they were not executing a military plan. They were delivering a verdict. The ground assault on the chamber, the orbital deployment of the fleet, the cyber attack on the broadcast networks, these were not separate actions. They were different facets of the same response. The mother's suffering was the central node, the emotional and strategic core that gave purpose to every move. The Empire, in its arrogance, had concentrated its leadership and its attention on a single point, believing it was a show of force. The family used that concentration against them, making the Empire's heart the target for a synchronized strike across every domain of conflict. They didn't fight a war on multiple fronts. They fought a single unified war where the front was everywhere at once. The eldest brother raised his hand. The gesture was quiet, but it silenced the room more effectively than any shout. He looked at the insectoid magistrate, his face a mask of cold finality. "The offer is simple," he said. His voice did not carry anger. It carried certainty, unconditional surrender. "Release every human prisoner. Dismantle your occupation of our territories. Stand down your fleets, or we burn your capital to the ground and keep going until there is nothing left of your empire but dust and stories about your arrogance." The words were not a negotiation. They were a verdict, a choice between 2 endings. The tension was no longer about a fight. It was about a decision. Every being in the hall understood the weight. The weapons in the walls were aimed. The fleet blocked the stars. The broadcast was live. The Empire faced its own reflection in the calm, implacable eyes of a human child, and the image was not flattering. They saw their own pride, their cruelty, their unshakable belief in their own supremacy, and they saw it turned against them as the justification for their own erasure. This was not a bluff. It was a mathematical certainty. The numbers were all on the human side now. The siblings' long patience had finally run its course. Mercy had been on the table. A genuine offer to walk away, to end the conflict with a simple acknowledgement of wrong and a promise to do better. It had been refused, dismissed with scorn. That door was now closed, locked. The only thing remaining was consequence. The Empire was being given the rare, terrible privilege of choosing its own punishment. It could choose obedience, a humiliating but living end, or it could choose destruction, a final, fiery act of pride that would be its epitaph. The choice was stark. It was binary. There were no other options, no clever loopholes, no last-minute reprieves. The ultimatum worked because it was not a threat. It was a statement of fact. The eldest sibling's demeanor sold it. He was not emotional. He was not gloating. He was a man reading a prepared statement of an inevitable outcome. His calm was more terrifying than any rage. It communicated that this was not a moment of passion, but the culmination of a long, cold calculation. The Empire's survival was no longer a question of might. It was a question of choice, theirs. The credibility of the threat was absolute. It was backed by the silent fleet overhead, the weapons in the walls, and the absolute, unshakable resolve in the siblings' eyes. They had already won. This was just the paperwork. The countdown was the final tool. A simple, inexorable ticking clock. It made the decision immediate. It forced the Empire to confront its fate in real time, with every passing second narrowing the options from deliberation to reaction. The ultimatum forced the choice by removing every other variable. It simplified a complex galactic conflict into a single brutal equation: surrender or annihilation. There was no third option, no room for debate, no time for appeals. The Empire's leaders were trapped in a box of their own making, and the lid was being nailed shut. They had to choose between the total loss of their power or the total loss of their existence. The siblings made the term so simple, so final, that hesitation itself became a form of answer. They arrived without fanfare. The stars above the capital did not vanish. They were blotted out. A silent, dark tide of rough metal forms moved across the sky. They were not polished like Imperial cruisers. They were scarred. They were built for function, not for show, carrying the memory of 1,000 storms, looking like predators that had clawed their way through extinction to get here. They held position, a wall of shadow and intent. The human fleet had come, and it did so not with a battle cry but with a terrible, absolute silence. This was perfect synchronization. Not just of ships, but of will. Every vessel held its place. Every weapon system was aligned. The chamber confrontation, the broadcast, the hidden guns in the walls, it was the opening act. This was the main event. The scale of the response dwarfed the insult. The fracture of the old order was not a crack. It was a cascade. On the ground, data networks collapsed as the fleet's electronic warfare suite overwhelmed them. In the sky, Imperial patrol craft, their lights bright moments before, went dark and drifted. It was a system failure on a galactic level. Their systems were proud. They were also brittle, built on a foundation of unshakable superiority that was now being shaken. They were cruel, designed to inflict pain on others, not to endure it themselves. The fleet's arrival was the first real pain they had ever felt, and their systems did not know how to process it. They began to collapse from the shock. This was not an invasion in the imperial sense. It was not about conquest for territory. It was reclamation. The Empire had stolen peace, security, and dignity. Humanity was here to take it all back. With interest, the children's work was done. The patient, meticulous infiltration of the chamber, the careful arming of the Empire's own heart, the masterful manipulation of their networks. It was the scalpel work, precise, targeted. The fleet's work was different. It was the sledgehammer. It was the final, undeniable argument of scale. The Empire thought it was fighting a family. It was fighting an entire species that had been quietly, patiently, building its answer to a long, cold war they didn't know they were losing. How did this transformation happen? It was not sudden. It was a choice, a decision made in the quiet years of occupation. While the Empire saw victims, humanity was building. While the Empire mocked their crude machines, those machines were being refined. While they laughed at human wars as petty, the strategies were being studied, evolved, and adapted for a much larger battlefield. The apparent weakness was a feint, a long, deep breath held before the strike. They transformed by refusing the Empire's definition of them. They let their enemy believe the lie of their inferiority, all the while forging the tools to prove it false. The fear they would eventually inspire was not born from sudden power. It was born from the chilling realization that they had possessed this power all along, and had chosen, for a very long time, not to use it. The galaxy's most feared species was not the one with the biggest guns. It was the one with the deepest patience and the coldest resolve. The eldest brother looked at the assembled rulers of the galaxy. His voice was low. It did not carry anger. It carried a final fact. "You're not the threat," he said. "We're the warning." The words were simple. They landed in the quiet hall and changed the air. This was not a boast of victory. It was a statement of function. A classification. The Empire had spent centuries believing it was the ultimate power, the thing other civilizations should fear. They were wrong. They were the reason for the fear. They were the object lesson. Their role was not the predator. It was the example. The real danger was not rebellion. It was never about a noisy, disorganized fight for freedom. The real danger was resolve. The quiet, cold, multi-generational kind. The kind that plants a tree knowing you will never sit in its shade. The Empire's momentary cruelty, their public torture of a single mother, was a flash in the pan. A brief hot spark. Humanity's response was the cold, deep ocean that swallowed the spark without a sizzle. Their patience was a weapon they had forged over years of silence, and its edge was sharper than any blade they could have built in a hurry. This was not a victory speech. There was no celebration in his eyes. There was only the flat calm of a teacher delivering a difficult lesson that should have been learned long ago. The Empire had feared the wrong thing. They feared open defiance. They feared stolen ships and bombed outposts. They never feared the quiet. They never feared the mother who took the beating without a sound. They never feared the children who were not on the battlefield, but in the workshop, in the code, in the long, patient planning sessions. They feared the fist. They should have feared the will behind it. Humanity's teeth were shown through discipline, through the restraint to wait for the perfect moment, the absolute justification. The Empire's cruelty gave them that. It was the final piece, the provocation that turned strategic patience into righteous action. This was the warning, that ordinary people pushed far enough would not just forgive and forget, they would remember. They would plan. They would turn their ordinary lives into a cover for an extraordinary vengeance. A high school robotics club could become a weapons lab. A mother's endurance could become a battle standard. A family's love could become the most dangerous force in the galaxy. The galaxy would remember this day. Not as the day the Empire fell, but as the day the rules changed. The day it learned that strength is not about who has the biggest guns, but who has the deepest patience. The day it understood that some lines once crossed cannot be uncrossed with an apology. The consequences are baked into the crossing. The eldest sibling's warning was this: their actions here were not the full measure of human response. They were merely the preview, a demonstration of capability and resolve, the promise that if the Empire or any power ever attempted such cruelty again, the response would not be a repeat of this. It would be worse. It would be the main event. The warning was a shadow on the future, a permanent check on imperial ambition. It was the simple, chilling certainty that they were not the monsters in the story. They were the reason the monsters were awakened. And the monsters had a long memory. Her chains were still on, but her spirit was already free. She looked at her children standing in the ruin of an empire's pride. Her voice was a whisper. The words were for them alone, but they carried the weight of what had been done. "What have you unleashed?" she asked. It was not a question of regret. It was a question of scale. She saw the weapons in the walls. She saw the shadow of the fleet above. She saw the fear on the faces of creatures who had laughed at her pain moments before. Her personal suffering, her torn skin and bruised ribs had been the spark. It had ignited a galaxy. This was not just vengeance. It was a redefinition. The game itself had changed. The rules were different now. The balance of power, held for centuries by the Empire, had shifted in a single afternoon. It was not a temporary shift. It was a permanent reset. Her children had not simply won a battle. They had rewritten the contract between their species and the galaxy. They had taken the Empire's concept of strength, brute force, public cruelty, overwhelming technology, and broken it over their knee. They introduced a new kind of strength, the strength of patience, the strength of the quiet plan. The children looked at her. They acknowledged the truth in her question. They were never weak. Their apparent submission during the long years of occupation was a choice, a strategic pose. They were patient. They waited. They stored their anger and their ingenuity. letting it grow in the dark until the Empire itself provided the justification for its use. The public torture of their mother was that justification. It was the provocation that turned their restraint into righteous action. They did not start this. They finished it. The siblings' strategy was a blend of cold restraint and brutal precision. The eldest's mind laid out the long game. The multi-layered assault was his design. The infiltration of the chamber, the arming of the walls, the coordination with the fleet. It was a clockwork operation where every piece had to move at the exact right time. His restraint was in the planning, the patience to wait months, even years, for the pieces to fall into place. His precision was in the execution. The flawless timing that brought them all into the hall at the moment of maximum Imperial arrogance and minimum Imperial readiness. The middle sibling provided the technical precision. His restraint was in his quiet study of their systems, his deep understanding of their weaknesses. He did not attack their tech with brute force. He subverted it with a casual, almost dismissive mastery. His precision was in the flick of a wrist that turned their security into a liability, the tap of a key that hijacked their global broadcast. He made their greatest achievements look like childish toys. The youngest sibling was the brutal precision itself. His restraint was in holding back until the signal was given. His precision was in the controlled chaos of his movements, the unpredictable violence that was held on a tight leash until the moment it was needed. He was the spark to the gunpowder his siblings had laid. Together they pushed the Empire toward its choice, not with shouted threats, but with presented facts. The hidden guns, the silent fleet, the hijacked broadcast, these were not possibilities. They were realities. The Empire could surrender to those realities, or it could be annihilated by them. The offer was simple because the alternative was unthinkable. They combined the slow, patient work of years with the sharp, immediate violence of the moment. The Empire's brittle pride could not withstand the pressure. It had to break. They gave it no other option. Humanity showed its teeth that day, not in a snarl, but in a cold, deliberate smile. The Empire would never make the mistake of shooting a human mother again. Not out of mercy, out of a deep cellular understanding of the cost. The pain they had inflicted, the public spectacle they had created, was transformed. It ceased to be a tool of suppression and became humanity's greatest strategic advantage. It was the justification, the rallying point, the perfect moral high ground from which to launch an attack that was both righteous and absolute. They had given their enemy the reason to become its most lethal self. The episode became a permanent warning and a turning point in galactic history. This was not an end. It was a new beginning. A recalibration of power based on a simple, terrifying equation that every species now had to factor into their diplomacy. The fear that once defined humanity, fear of their perceived weakness, their fragmentation, their simplicity, evaporated. In its place grew a different, colder kind of dread, the fear of human patience, the understanding that their silence was not submission. It was storage. They would take your cruelty, catalog it, and wait for the perfect moment to return it to you with compounded interest. The galaxy learned a hard, fast lesson about mothers' children. 3 kids armed with little more than resolve and a deep understanding of their enemy's blind spots had not just claimed vengeance. They had rewritten the rules of engagement. They proved that galactic dominance was not about the size of your fleet, but the depth of your strategy. The Empire's crown jewel, its impenetrable capital and the confidence of its ruling class, was not taken by a prolonged siege. It was shattered by a perfectly synchronized assault that struck at every level of their society at once, militarily, technologically, and psychologically. They were defeated not by a greater force but by a smarter one. The eldest sibling's final warning was the thing that would echo in the silent halls of imperial power for generations. It was not a threat of further violence. It was a statement of principle, delivered with the quiet certainty of a natural law. He said the Empire was not the threat. Humanity was the warning. This redefined the entire conflict. They were not a foe to be defeated in battle. They were a consequence to be avoided, a permanent check on arrogance. The warning was that this display of force was not the limit of their capability. It was merely a demonstration, a sample. The promise that if the line was ever crossed again, the response would not be a repeat performance. It would be something new, something worse, built upon the lessons of this day. The Empire's eternal haunting would be the knowledge that they had awakened a sleeping giant and provided the blueprint for their own obsolescence. They would live with the certainty that their greatest failure was not underestimating human strength, but underestimating their capacity to wait for the perfect moment to use it. From mother's chains to children's victory, the line was never broken. It was tested, stretched thin, but it held. Her silence in the chamber was not the end of something. It was the middle, the part where pressure builds. The unbroken line of human resilience runs through generations. It is not taught, it is inherited. A quiet fire passed from hand to hand, like coals hidden beneath ash waiting for the right wind. The suffering she endured did not weaken her. It was converted. It became strength unleashed, a potential energy stored in the bones of her children, in the lines of code written by the middle sibling, in the battle plans drawn by the eldest. The pain was not wasted. It was fuel. The Empire saw a woman breaking. They were watching a battery charge. This was not a single family story. It is a species pattern, a recurring theme in human history. You push them down, and they use the pressure to build a foundation for what comes next. The elder alien in the chamber had been right from the beginning. His warning, dismissed as the rambling of an old fool, was the only clear sight in the room. They are never singular. He saw the truth they all missed. Humans are never alone. They are nodes in a network, a hive mind not of telepathy but of shared purpose. When one is struck, the signal travels. It is felt. They gather force in silence. They do not announce their plans. They make them. In workshops lit by single bulbs, in basements filled with scavenged parts, in quiet rooms where strategies are whispered. The Empire saw peace. They saw submission. They were watching the deep breath before the strike. The gathering. They strike with coordinated precision, not as individuals but as a single organism with a million hands. The fleet in orbit, the weapons in the walls, the broadcast across the stars, these were not separate actions. They were the manifestations of a single will, a decision made long ago and executed with cold, patient grace. The Empire learned this too late. They learned that humanity's greatest transformation was internal. It happened in the dark, away from their sensors. The shift from a parent victim to the galaxy's most feared species was not an accident. It was a choice. A deliberate, conscious decision to use the Empire's own tools against it. They did not suddenly become powerful. They revealed the power they had always possessed but had chosen, for strategic reasons, to conceal. Their perceived weakness was a feint, a long con played on a galactic scale. They transformed by letting the Empire define them as weak, all the while building the means to prove that definition catastrophically wrong. The fear they inspire now is not born from new weapons or ships. It is born from the chilling realization of their depth, their patience, their willingness to endure unimaginable pain to achieve an ultimate decisive victory. They are feared because they demonstrated that their capacity for retaliation is not limited by their technology, but only by their imagination and their resolve. The Empire made the fatal error of judging their book by its cover, never suspecting the devastating story written within. The galaxy learned a new rule that day. Not a law written in their halls of power, but a truth written in the silent patience of a mother's eyes. Strength isn't about the size of your gun or the reach of your fleet. It's the quiet capacity to absorb pain and convert it into strategy, to let suffering become the fuel for a fire you decide when to light. Humanity's true weapon wasn't in their ships overhead, but in their willpower to wait until the moment was perfect for absolute victory. The walls came alive. What the Empire revered as beautiful artistry, the crystalline panels that lined the grand chamber, the intricate geometric patterns forged by their finest artisans, now slid aside. From behind them, human-made weapons slid forward on silent rails. Coil gun barrels, matte black and perfectly cylindrical, micro-missile pods, their hatches clicking open. They emerged from the Empire's own sacred architecture, a perversion of its purpose. The most secure room in the galaxy had been meticulously transformed into a death trap, and the guests of honor were already inside. Every decorative element held lethal intent. The opaline inlays along the floor were not just decoration. They concealed targeting sensors. The soaring crystal pillars were not just supports. They housed power conduits feeding the very weapons now aimed at the crowd. The siblings had not brought an army with them. They had built one, piece by piece, inside the Empire's strongest citadel, using the Empire's own materials and labor. The work was done over months, hidden inside shipments of cultural exchange items and humanitarian aid. The Empire, in its arrogance, had accepted gifts from a people it considered broken, never thinking to X-ray their own walls for a surprise. This was the ultimate smuggling operation. They did not smuggle weapons past the guards. They smuggled them through the front door with a smile and a bowed head. The mercy the eldest offered was not a philosophical concept. It was a physical thing they had delivered and installed under the noses of their captors. The Empire's period of peace was not a respite. It was a logistics chain, a slow, deliberate arming of the heart of their enemy. They had, with cheerful cooperation, built their own coffin. This was not theft. It was repurposing. The Imperial craftsmen who polished the crystals, the engineers who tuned the energy flow, the architects who designed the chamber for both beauty and impenetrability, they had all unknowingly worked for humanity. Their skill, their pride, their technological mastery was now channeled toward a single goal: holding their own leaders at gunpoint. The chamber's legendary beauty was its critical vulnerability. Its grandeur provided the perfect cover. No one looks for flaws in something they believe is perfect. What system did they use? They used the Empire itself. The hidden weapons were a network, not a single device. It was a system built on patience and misdirection. The middle sibling's device was just the key. The locks were already in the walls, installed over months. He simply turned them. The weapons were a mix of coil guns for precision and missile pods for area denial, but their real power was their placement. They were everywhere, covering every angle. There was no cover. The Empire's sacred chamber, a symbol of its unstoppable power, was now a perfectly designed shooting gallery, and the nobility were the targets. The siblings hid their entire arsenal in plain sight, trusting their enemy's vanity to be the best camouflage. They exploited the one flaw the Empire never guarded against: its own sense of superiority. The middle sibling's fingers tapped a final command on his scratched device. Across the hall, the Empire's massive primary view screen flickered. For a moment it showed the Imperial crest. Then it died. But it was not a failure. It was a handoff. On 1,000 worlds, on 1 billion screens in living rooms and public squares and command decks, that same screen woke up. The signal did not come from a broadcast tower. It came from the heart of the Imperial chamber itself. The Empire's own communication network, the web that bound its worlds together, had been hijacked. The strongest voice in the galaxy now had a new owner. The live feed showed the hall, the chained human mother, the gathered elite in their finery, the insectoid magistrates on their thrones. The view was perfect, clear. It was the Empire's own camera system designed for ceremonial records now providing the footage. The audience was no longer the aliens in the room. The audience was the galaxy. They became witnesses, not to a display of imperial power but to their own humiliation. They watched themselves watching a torture. The spectacle they had created to cow a species was now a public confession of their own cruelty. Their bravado, their arrogance, it all played out in high definition for every citizen, every ally, every rival to see. The middle sibling's voice came over the feed, calm, clear. It was not a shout. It was a question directed at the entire galaxy. How's it feel being the villains in someone else's bedtime story? The line was simple, brutal. It reframed the entire conflict. This was not a military defeat. This was a narrative one. They were no longer the heroes of their own saga. They were the monsters in humanity's. The question echoed across star systems, turning military might into a moral failure. Legitimacy, the foundation of any empire, began to shift. It was no longer about who had the most ships. It was about who owned the story. This was not combat. It was public relations warfare. The battlefield moved from a single room to every living room tuned to the feed. The Empire's strength, its terrifying displays of power, became global entertainment, and not the kind that inspired fear. The kind that inspired ridicule. The gelatinous nobles rippling with unease. The reptilian generals frozen in confusion. The insectoid magistrates rendered speechless. It was a comedy of errors staged on a galactic scale. Their authority, once absolute, now depended on the perception of billions of strangers who were seeing them not as rulers, but as fools. The siblings turned the Empire's greatest tool against it: control of information. They used the network built for propaganda to broadcast a truth more damaging than any lie. The torture of one mother became the indictment of an entire civilization. The middle sibling's technological prowess was the key. He didn't just hijack a signal. He repurposed the entire grid. Imperial distress calls were not blocked. They were rerouted, amplified, and fed back into the broadcast, adding a layer of desperate, panicked chatter to the visual of their leaders in disarray. The humiliation was total. It was a lesson in how to lose a war without firing a single shot, by simply letting your enemies show who they truly are to the entire universe. The three humans did not conquer the Empire with weapons. They conquered it with a camera feed and a perfectly timed question. The eldest brother checked his device. His expression did not change. He looked at the magistrate and said, "Fleet's in position. You've got about 30 seconds. It was not a boast. It was a time check. A simple update on a schedule already in motion. The personal confrontation in the chamber. The vengeance for their mother, it was just one piece. The opening move. The real game was happening above their heads. In the silence that followed, a low, deep hum vibrated through the stone floor. It was not from the hall. It came from above. Through the crystalline dome of the ceiling, the stars began to wink out. Not one by one. In clusters. In swathes. A shadow fell across the entire capital city. A darkness that was not the absence of light, but the presence of something vast. The personal had just become planetary. A family's grievance had escalated to a species-level response. Humanity had learned to fight on every front at once. The scale of it made the Imperial jaw drop. Their faces, a gallery of alien shock, turned upward. They understood raids. They understood insurrections. This was different. This was a coordinated strategy that operated on a level they had not considered possible. The chamber was the focal point, the brain of the operation, but the body of the attack was in orbit. The siblings on the ground were the scalpel. The fleet above was the hammer. Down in the chamber, the effects were immediate. A guard's communicator crackled with a burst of static, then died. Another's weapon power cell read 0. The defensive energy pylons surrounding the city, visible through the towering windows, flickered and went dark. The Imperial warships in high orbit, their lights bright in the night sky, simply went silent. Their running lights extinguished. They became dark, dead things hanging in the void. The middle siblings' work on the ground had been the key in the lock. The grid was controlled, isolated. The Empire's might was disarmed in a single silent moment. The real fun was not here. It was about to begin up there. The ground operation was containment. The orbital action was consequence. The children had not come alone. They had brought friends. An entire fleet hidden, patient, waiting for this exact signal. The Empire had assumed humanity possessed no fleet. They never said they didn't. It was a strategic deception, a patient lie held for the right moment. The fleet's arrival was the final argument. The undeniable scale that made resistance not just difficult but pointless. What fleet was waiting? Not a ragtag collection of stolen vessels. Not a desperate last stand. It was a coordinated force, built in secret, trained in the dark. Its existence a myth until the moment it was needed. It was the product of years of planning and hidden construction, a mirror to the patient work done inside the chamber walls. Its purpose was not just to win a battle, but to deliver a message written in the silent, shadowed forms of ships now blotting out the stars above the Imperial capital, their weapon systems online, their target acquisition complete, waiting for the 30-second clock to hit 0. The chamber was the statement. The fleet was the exclamation point. One voice cut through the noise. The elder insectoid. His antennae drooped. His milky eyes, which had seen wars that burned out stars, saw the pattern now. He saw the woman's calm not as endurance, but as patience. He saw the children's arrival not as an assault, but as a reunion. He saw the entire hall, the gathered might of the Empire, not as a show of strength, but as a collected audience. He understood. His voice was a dry rasp, a sound of ancient dust disturbed. "This is no accident," he said. The words were quiet, but they landed in the sudden stillness. This was bait. The mother's suffering was never random. It was a lure. A calculated, precise piece of theater designed for one purpose, to draw them in. To gather the entire ruling class, the military high command, the intellectual elite of the Empire into one room, to focus their entire attention on a single point of perceived triumph. They thought they were orchestrating a lesson. They were the students and the test had already begun. Her chains, her silence, her whispered defiance, it was all a hook. And the Empire, in its arrogance, had swallowed it whole. They had fallen for the oldest human trick in the book. The Trojan horse, the feigned retreat, the show of weakness that masks an overwhelming strength. The Empire's strongest response, its most vital leaders, its most fearsome warriors were all here. They were concentrated, contained. The outer defenses were a shell. The real power of the Empire was in this room, watching a spectacle they believed they controlled. The trap was not something they had sprung. It was something they had walked into. The Elder's warning echoed. It did not bounce off the crystalline walls. It sank into them. It moved through the assembled nobles, a slow, chilling wave. The scorn on the gelatinous faces began to curdle. The amused clicks of insectoid mandibles faltered. The confident postures of the reptilian generals tightened. The realization did not arrive as a shout. It arrived as a silence, a collective intake of breath held too long. The pieces clicked into place. The woman's lack of fear, the children's impossible entrance, the casual dismantling of their technology. It was not a raid. It was a reckoning. They recognized the trap too late because they were blinded by their own myth. They believed in their own invincibility. They believed humanity was a scattered, broken species, capable only of individual acts of defiance. They dismissed the Elder's earlier warning that humans are never singular. They saw a mother and thought they saw a victim. They did not see the catalyst. They saw 3 children and thought they saw insurgents. They did not see the weapon. Their intelligence was perfect on paper. It counted ships and soldiers. It could not quantify resolve. It could not measure the patience of a species that plants forests, knowing it will never sit in their shade. They saw the display of cruelty as their victory lap. They never considered it might be their own starting line. By the time the Elder's raspy voice spelled it out for them, the starting pistol had already fired, and they were miles behind. A low groan echoed through the hall. Not from a throat, from the walls. Hidden panels that the nobility had passed for years, that they assumed were decorative inlays or ventilation conduits, slid open. They revealed not machinery but dark circular openings, barrels, human-made, unadorned, functional. They pointed inward toward the crowd. The Empire's own architecture had grown teeth, and they were all in its mouth. What the nobles saw as structural elements, as the veins of their power, had been repurposed, transformed. The siblings had not attacked the Empire from the outside. That would have been a war, an invasion. This was something else. A slow, careful poisoning. For months during what the Empire called a period of peace and compliance, the work had been done. While alien traders brought goods, while human representatives bowed and scraped, while the imperial bureaucracy swelled with its own importance, the hollowing out occurred. The siblings had been feeding the Empire's veins with poison. The barrels, the weapons, the systems, they were introduced slowly. A piece at a time. A component labeled as a cultural artifact. A power cell disguised as a medical supply. They slipped past inspections not through force but through misdirection and bureaucratic sleight of hand. The Empire's own complacency, its belief in its unbreachable security, was the delivery system. They accepted the gifts of a subdued species without looking too closely at the packaging. The mother's suffering was the final piece. The grand public distraction. While every eye was on her, while every sensor was focused on the spectacle of her pain, the last connections were made. The final component slotted into place. The Empire's heart was not just guarded. It was its own prison. The assault was not beginning. It was concluding. The real attack, the patient, meticulous restructuring of their very stronghold, had already happened weeks ago, months ago. This moment was not the detonation. It was the reveal. This was not an invasion. It was colonization in reverse. The Empire had spread across star systems, planting its flag and its architecture. Humanity had simply learned to grow within it, to use the structures built to contain them as their own arsenal. They turned strength into vulnerability. The chamber, a symbol of ultimate power, was now the perfect kill box, and the Empire had furnished it themselves. The months of peace were a lie. They were not a cessation of hostilities, but their continuation by other means. A campaign of preparation waged in plain sight, hidden by the Empire's own arrogance. The imperial craftsmen who built the panels, the technicians who maintained the systems, never knew. They were working on the very mechanisms that would later hold them at gunpoint. Their craftsmanship, their pride, now served a human purpose. How long had it taken? Since the first whispered plans. Since the first understanding that a head-on fight was a losing proposition. The eldest sibling's calm came from this knowledge. He was not commanding an assault. He was overseeing the final act of a long, patient operation. The Empire had been living inside a weapon they helped build, and they never felt the trigger being fitted into place until it was too late to let go. The duration was measured not in weeks, but in the slow, careful turning of an opponent's strength into a critical weakness. They didn't infiltrate a fortress. They grew a new one inside the old one, and then they removed the shell. The eldest brother looked up at the magistrate. His voice carried no threat. It was calm even, almost reasonable. He said, "We offer you mercy. Release her. Apologize. Make restitution." The words hung in the air. They were simple, clear, an offer of a way out, a clean end. It sounded like compassion. It felt like a trap. The middle sibling flicked his fingers. A complex crystalline security disk, humming with containment energy, clattered to the floor from a guard's belt. It rolled across the polished stone, a dead piece of junk. He didn't even look at it. He said, "My high school robotics club did better work than this." It was a quiet line, almost to himself, a muttered critique of shoddy craftsmanship. The insult was not in the volume. It was in the absolute dismissal. Their most advanced defensive tech was a child's discarded project to him. The quip was not arrogance. It was a fact. It reframed their entire empire from a mighty power to a poorly managed workshop. The magistrate began to sputter, a sound of outraged pheromones and clicking mandibles. The offer was genuine. That was the most terrifying part. They truly were offering a path to walk away. But the alternative, the unspoken thing that hung in the air after the word "or," was a void. A blank space of consequence they had not yet painted, but whose sheer potential turned the air cold. Mercy became a weight. A choice they had to make correctly. The elder's polite offer was not a negotiation. It was a test. A final exam for a civilization that had failed every prior lesson. The crowd felt the shift. The scorn and outrage curdled into something else. A dawning, cold apprehension. They were not dealing with rebels or soldiers. They were dealing with accountants presenting a final bill, and the interest was catastrophic. The youngest brother hefted his metal bar. He grinned, a bright, sharp thing in the tension. "Or we start the music," he said. It was a taunt, a tease, a phrase from a schoolyard game. It meant nothing to the aliens, and everything. It was the point of no return. The moment the offer of peace ended and the consequence began. It was not a declaration of war. It was a promise of a different kind of event. A party to which they were not invited guests. This was the calculated strategy. The eldest did not threaten. He presented options. He made the Empire an active participant in its own fate. The fear was not in the threat of force. It was in the burden of the choice. They had to decide. Surrender with dignity, or force the siblings to demonstrate why that was the only sane option. The fear came from looking at the calm, polite human and understanding that his mercy was the last and only gift they would receive. Everything after would be earned. He finished with a final, quiet warning. "We are giving you a choice. It's a rare thing. Don't make us regret it." The statement closed the loop. The mercy was theirs to offer, and the regret would be theirs to feel if it was refused. The power was no longer with the Empire. It was with the three children who had walked into its heart and asked a simple, terrifying question. The muscle in the eldest's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign that his patience, like their time, was running out. The middle brother reached into his satchel. It was not a military kit. It was a worn canvas bag covered in faded stickers, a band logo, a cartoon robot, a coffee stain. He pulled out a small black box, its surface scratched and taped. The insectoid magistrates watched, mandibles slack. Their own consoles were crystalline, humming with soft light. His looked like something from a garage sale. He tapped a sequence on his device. Across the hall, a bank of holographic security schematics flickered. Then they dissolved, replaced by a simple, pixelated image of a smiling Earth cartoon. It waved. The middle brother didn't smirk. He just tilted his head, studying the change as if checking a homework problem. The Empire's most advanced tactical display was now a child's screensaver. A guard lunged, a reptilian elite armor gleaming. The middle brother didn't look up. His fingers moved. The guard's energy shield fizzed and died. His weapons targeting system chirped and displayed a single word. Error. The guard stumbled, confused. The brother sighed, a small sound of disappointment. You should really update your firewalls, he said. His voice was flat, instructional. My high school robotics club had tougher locks. It was not a brag. It was a fact. A casual critique of their workmanship. The insult was so mundane it was devastating. He treated their sacred tools like disposable trinkets. A security disk, a marvel of alien engineering, dropped from a console. He caught it, examined its glowing core for a second, then tossed it over his shoulder. It clattered on the floor like a bottle cap. The gesture was effortless, dismissive. This was not hacking. It was redefinition. He wasn't breaking their systems. He was showing them what their systems actually were. Fragile, poorly made, obsolete. He was a master watchmaker looking at a child's toy clock. The nobles in the crowd began to shift. Their confidence, built on generations of believing their technology was the pinnacle of the galaxy, started to crack. It was a quiet crumbling, a dawning, horrifying doubt. If a human child with a box of scraps could nullify their might, what did that say about their entire civilization? Their superiority was not just challenged. It was made laughable, and the laughter was the true weapon. The youngest brother grinned, watching the chaos. Big room, fancy lights, he said, spinning his metal bar. Feels like Friday night basketball back home, except uglier. The joke was stupid, simple. It landed like a hammer. It took their grand hall of power, their ceremony of dominance, and reduced it to a poorly decorated gymnasium. Fear could be fought. Mockery disarmed them completely. They were not just being defeated. They were being ridiculed. Their sacred technology was a joke. Their authority was a punchline. The middle siblings' power wasn't in complex code or superior hardware. It was in perspective. He saw their galactic engineering not as magic, but as mechanics. A system of cause and effect, a puzzle. He'd solved harder ones for a grade. His high school knowledge wasn't a metaphor. It was the toolkit. He understood fundamental principles of energy, systems, and logic. Their technology was just a fancy, overly complicated application of those same principles. He didn't need to outbuild them. He just needed to understand what they'd built better than they did. He found the seams they'd glued over and pulled. The Empire's greatest weakness was its own arrogance, its belief that complexity equaled strength. He proved that simplicity, understood deeply, was stronger. The youngest moved. It looked like a mess. A sprawl of limbs and a heavy bar of metal, but it was a practice mess. A specific kind of chaos. The bar spun in his grip, not like a warrior's weapon, but like a kid with a stick on a long walk home. It was a tool, a prop. It could crack a skull or just tap a rhythm against the floor. He kept its purpose a secret. The reptilian guards shifted. Their training was ancient. Their doctrines were carved in stone and taught for generations. They knew how to fight honor. They knew how to counter skill. They had no answer for this. The boy's walk was a slouch. His grip on the bar was loose, almost careless, but his eyes were sharp. They flicked from guard to guard, not assessing threats but choosing targets. He wasn't preparing for a fight. He was deciding how to start one, and he looked like he was enjoying the decision. They hesitated. Seasoned killers, veterans of 100 campaigns, paused before this youthful confidence. It was not the confidence of strength. It was the confidence of someone who has never been truly hurt and believes on some deep level that he never will be. It was a faith more powerful than skill. It unnerved them. Their training told them to watch the weapon, to analyze the stance. His stance was all wrong. His weapon was a crude piece of scrap. Their doctrine had no category for him. Every movement was a tease. He'd spin the bar, let it slip in his hand, and catch it an inch from the floor. He'd step toward a guard, not in an attack stance, but in the casual way you'd step toward a vending machine. He'd smile. A wide, open grin that held no mirth, only a bright, chilling promise. It promised that whatever happened next would be unpredictable. It would be messy. It would be fun, but only for him. The generals saw it. The elder reptilian commanders, their scales marked with old campaign honors, recognized the pattern. This was not a flaw. It was a style. Perfected recklessness. It was a combat form built on the principle that the opponent's expectations are the real battlefield. He didn't follow their rules. He made his own on the spot and dared them to keep up. Their ancient doctrines, their proud traditions of single combat and honorable engagement, were suddenly obsolete. They were textbooks and he was a live wire. What made it so terrifying was the sheer economy of it. He used so little to project so much threat. A smile, a twitch of the wrist, a lazy spin of a metal bar. He didn't need glowing blades or energy shields. He had the unshakable belief of youth and the simple, brutal physics of leverage and impact. He moved like the fight was already over and he was just tidying up. The bar wasn't just a weapon. It was an anchor to a reality they didn't understand. A reality where their power, their technology, their history meant nothing. It was just him, a piece of metal and a complete refusal to be afraid. That was the true weapon, and it was one they had no defense against. They chained her in front of their entire ruling class. A human mother, beaten but not broken. She whispered one phrase that made the insectoid magistrate recoil. Mothers don't beg. They just wait for their kids to come home. What they didn't realize was that her children weren't just coming home. They were coming for everything. The grand hall filled with them. Not people, not citizens, specimens. Chitinous magistrates' mandibles clicking in cold unison. Gelatinous nobles shimmering with detached amusement. Armored reptilian generals standing like statues carved from old wars. They came to see a thing break. A simple human female at the center of so much polished alien architecture. Her hair showed threads of gray where it wasn't matted with sweat. Her wrists were raw and ringed. The electro rod had left its angry pattern across her back. They had positioned her on a raised dais not to elevate her, but so every being in attendance could watch the moment her human dignity shattered. They waited for the sounds. The pleading, the bargaining, the eventual sobbing surrender. That was the script. It was a show of force, a political lesson disguised as punishment. Keep your species in line. Remember your place. But the room held only the hum of alien technology and the dry rustle of carapaces shifting in seats. Her silence was not empty. It was a different kind of sound. A pressure. She watched them back, her gaze steady. Not on the magistrate on his hovering throne, but on the faces in the crowd. She was taking inventory, marking them. An elder among the insectoids, his antennae twitching with a slower, more troubled rhythm, leaned toward the magistrate. His voice was a low rasp that cut through the anticipatory stillness. They are never singular. It wasn't a full warning. It was a piece of one, a fragment of old learned caution. He saw past the performance. He saw the woman's calm not as brokenness but as waiting. The Empire thought it was demonstrating an unbreakable grip. It was putting its own neck on the block. This ceremony, this theater of cruelty, revealed a deep and fatal misunderstanding. They believed strength was the ability to inflict pain without consequence. They did not understand that true strength is the capacity to endure it for a purpose. Every laugh from a gelatinous noble, every approving click from a magistrate, was a note in their own indictment. They were not witnesses to human weakness. They were an audience to their own. The spectacle was meant to cow a species. Instead, it became a beacon. Why go to such lengths? Why chain a single mother before the ruling elite of the galaxy? Fear, not hers, theirs. The faint, unacknowledged dread that humanity's compliance was a choice, not a condition. This was their attempt to make that choice for them. A desperate, dramatic act to prove they were in control, precisely because some part of them knew they were not. The public torture was a warning shot that missed its mark and revealed the shooter's position completely. The chains were not just restraints. They were engineered. Each link delivered a low-grade current designed to fray the nerves, to make a simple breath feel like swallowing glass. The platform hummed with it. They built this entire apparatus not for execution, but for degradation. For the moment a sentient mind dissolves into raw animal sound, she gave them nothing, not a flinch, not a whimper, just her eyes moving across the crowd, a slow, quiet tracking. Every face she looked at, she held for a second. She measured them. They expected the crinkle of pain around her eyes, the wet shine of tears. They got the flat calm of a mechanic inspecting a flawed engine. The nobles stirred in their seats. The reptilian generals shifted their weight. The gelatinous forms rippled with impatience. This was not entertainment. This was a vigil. The spectacle was supposed to be her, but she had turned it back on them. Her silence became the main event, and they were the ones performing. They were the ones laid bare by their own growing discomfort, by their need for a show she refused to give. She controlled her breath. In, out. each one a small act of defiance. A rhythm against the chaos they tried to impose. The electrorod would strike and her body would jolt, but her lungs would pull air back in on the exact same count. She owned the space between the pain. She was mapping the moments of suffering, not enduring them. It was a tactical exercise. A rehearsal. Her whisper cut through the hum of machinery and the rustle of restless dignitaries. It was not loud. It did not need to be. In a room starved for the sound of her breaking, her voice carried like a shockwave. Mothers don't beg. The words landed not as a plea but as a statement of fact. A new law written in the heart of their empire. It was a counter-narrative to their entire display of dominance. They thought they were demonstrating power. She was teaching them its definition. This was not submission. It was the opposite. Her silence was a weapon. Her calm was a strategy. She was bait and she knew it. The elder alien saw it, that look in her eyes. It wasn't the emptiness of defeat. It was the sharp, terrifying focus of a hunter who has already won and is just waiting for the prey to realize it. The Empire's grand celebration of its own cruelty had become a quiet, tense waiting room. Why did a woman who could have evaded capture, who could have fought, who clearly possessed a will strong enough to withstand this, simply allow it to happen? Because the stage was necessary. The audience was essential. Her suffering was the lure. It drew the entire ruling structure of the Empire into one room, arrogant and distracted, to witness what they believed was their ultimate victory. They gathered to watch a prisoner. They did not know they were assembling for their own trial. The main doors opened without a sound. No alarm, no guards rushing in. The three figures that entered did not look like soldiers. They looked like pieces. A single unit moving in, the eldest led. His stride was slow even, measured. He did not look at the guards lining the walls. He did not glance at the magistrates. His eyes went directly to the center of the room, to the woman on the platform. That simple act, that unerring focus, redefined the space. It was no longer their hall of power. It was his destination. The crowd, a moment ago restless and cruel, went still. The air changed. He moved with the quiet authority of a man walking into his own kitchen at night, knowing where every piece of furniture stood in the dark. He owned the room not by conquest, but by sheer, uncontested certainty. Behind him, the middle one flicked a wrist. A small, almost dismissive gesture. Across the hall, a bank of security monitors flickered and died. A low hum from the energy field around the magistrate's podium cut out. It was not a violent shutdown. It was a casual dismissal. The systems did not fail. They were simply turned off like a child bored with a toy. The alien tech, the pride of their empire, became irrelevant under that casual mastery. It was a deeper insult than any shouted threat. The youngest came last. He carried a length of polished metal bar, its end darkened and slightly bent. He spun it once in his hand, a lazy, practiced motion. His smile was wide open and utterly without warmth. It was the smile of a kid who just found something fun to break. His confidence was not the seasoned calm of a veteran. It was the reckless, terrifying confidence of youth that has not yet learned to fear consequences. He looked at the armored reptilian guards not as opponents but as obstacles. Interesting ones, the three of them, a triad of purpose, and at their center their fixed point, their mother. Her battered presence anchored them. The eldest's eyes softened for a fraction of a second when he saw her, a crack in the granite calm. Then it was gone. He reached the base of the platform and stopped. He looked up at the insectoid magistrate not with defiance but with a chilling, polite acknowledgement. "Thank you," he said. His voice was calm, clear, and carried to every corner of the silent hall, "for keeping our mother entertained." The words were courteous. The tone was not. It was a verdict. It was the first move in a game they had already been playing for a long time, and the Empire had just realized, too late, that they were not the players. They were the board. The siblings were not three separate fighters. They were three aspects of a single weapon. The mind, the hand, and the spark. Strategy, system, and strike. How did three humans, three children by their standards, simply walk into the most heavily fortified stronghold in the galaxy? They did not infiltrate it. They used the front door. They walked in because the Empire's attention, its entire might, was focused on one woman in chains. They had drawn every eye, every guard, every sensor to this room. The outer defenses were a hollow shell, manned by automatons following a protocol that had already been rewritten. The strongest door is useless if you leave it open yourself. They did not break the fortress. They let the fortress break itself for them.